Martin Wilsey.
Hey, I'm Shay McGalley.
I'm David Keener.
And I'm Jeff Patterson.
And this is the Hourlings podcast project. Tonight, Dave's driving the bus.
And let me maybe get this PowerPoint going. All right. So tonight's episode is on economics in science fiction. And that's a pretty broad subject. So we decided to focus on one sort of subject area, the solar system. So I don't know. Have you ever read an SF book or watched an SF film and said, there's no way that this is economically viable? There's just no way this could work.
The Death Star, that must have cost like billions and billions and billions.
Yep. Or a certain science fiction film where a deposed emperor secretly builds a 1,000-ship space fleet with these giant star cruisers, and nobody knew it was happening.
Or knew he was alive, yeah.
Yeah. Or alien invaders come to Earth to steal our water. There's water everywhere in the universe. Or a wealthy man spends billions of dollars to create dinosaurs for a theme park. It makes a good movie, but is it really going to work economically? So economics can be important for stories, and we're going to look at a typical common SF setting and discuss how the economics will work for that. And our setting is going to be pretty simple. It's going to be our solar system with a solar system spanning civilization, what they call an intrasolar civilization. With, we're going to say this is fairly well established. It's got colonies on the moon and various planets, Mars, et cetera, smaller habitations on other moons and asteroids, science outposts all over the place. Space stations are common. And, just for grins and giggles, assuming some advances in technologies, here are some average travel times to some of the planets. Right? So, it's going to take, if you want to go to Pluto, it's going to take you about 9.5 years. Mars, maybe 3 months. So, economics is driven by some key factors. What do people want or need? Scarcity, how common are these things? Transport limitations, what does it take to get it where it needs to go? And services, who supports these things? So let's talk a little bit about these things. In this setting, as I've laid it out, what are the things that people need? For you guys, what are the things that people need? Marty?
They need air, they need water, they need food, and and then it's probably specialty items depending on where they live in the solar system.
All right, Jeff? I've
Yeah,
already said the basics.
The pyramid of human needs is pretty much intact, even at the solar system scale. But there's also going to be a need for communication and accountability, and ways of, the internet, social media, something like that. It will clearly be superseded by something else in the future that works differently, that is more immersive or something along those lines. And I think you're going to see stuff like that running in the background. And if so, just like Facebook and Twitter became a major part of the economy, they will as well.
Of course, they'll have to take into account.
They're going to need security.
You're going to need security?
Yeah.
Okay. And also in response to Jeff's internet for the solar system, is going to have to take into account light speed lag to the planets. All right, Shay?
I think they'll need temperature control.
For sure.
And then other, medical advancements, like I think in one of our episodes we talked about how devastating it is on the human body to not have gravity. So other things like that, kept in mind.
Yeah, I think one of your big hazards in space is radiation. And of course, radiation is bad for procreation. So I could see some, especially if you live in the outer system, or if you live on the asteroids or something like that, you may want to have that sperm bank or that egg bank to make sure that your genetic future is left intact, et cetera, et cetera. Plus medical treatment for radiation, all kinds of ways of dealing with the medical impacts of being in space. So I think you've pegged it, Shay. So those are some of the basic needs. What are some of the things that people would want? They don't have to have them, but what makes living elsewhere interesting in the solar system?
Well, entertainment. I think people will always want, bourbon, good food, definitely. I mean, it's the standard entertainment things that we want now.
I think people want their pets. I think there's a big population that would say, hell no, not without my dog.
Or if I can't bring my cat, it's not happening.
Exactly.
I think that's one of the reasons why robot dogs, that they're trying to normalize them so much to kind of wean us off the real thing, so that 100 years from now, when we do have to evac the planet, we don't feel bad about leaving dogs behind.
No. I love my dogs.
So
They're
we
kind
would need space veterinarians for sure.
All right, what else?
Well, standard transportation. I mean, if you're going to support an economic model that expands out to the whole solar system, I mean, you're still going to need to be able to get from point A to point B. Not everybody's going to have their own spaceship. So how are you going to have transportation?
Yeah, so there's got to be some kind of organized system of transport. They can also have things. Have you heard of a loop?
Yeah.
It's basically where you take something like a space station or say a hollowed out asteroid, and you make it livable, and then you put it in an orbit, say going between the orbits of Earth and Mars. So you want to go to Mars, you take a fast rocket to intercept this little asteroid at the proper point in its orbit, and then you live and work on that asteroid for let's say 3 months, and then you catch a really fast ship on the other side, and it takes you to Mars. So you don't have to do the whole trip. There's already something going at speed that you just catch the ride on. Stuff like that.
You don't have any hand wavium that gets you everywhere in the solar system in a matter of days.
Yeah, see, that was the thing. I didn't want any hand wavium here. So we're assuming some advancements, but no frictionless drive, no inertia drive, no faster than light travel. We could do another economic scenario with that stuff, at some other point if we want. So we've got travel times.
Yeah, and you need to be able to find a way to monetize the thing that you do. I mean, if we have learned anything from the last 10 years, it's been that alternate ways of earning money and alternate ways of actually utilizing money are people can adapt to that pretty quickly. And the fact that so much of the internet got monetized as quickly as it did, and as big as it did, was one of those things that science fiction writers did not predict. When YouTube appeared on the scene, nobody thought anybody in the future would ever be a YouTuber, and now they number in the millions.
Yeah, now it can be a profession.
Yes.
All right, let's talk about scarcity, because scarcity is one of those things that drives value, that drives prices. Shay, let's start with you this time. How or what might be scarce and therefore become a prized commodity in a setting like this?
Wow, that's a scary thing to think about. I would hope that things like water would not become things that you would fight over. Gosh, I mean.
Well, we can talk about that. I don't think water would be that uncommon.
Okay. Can you imagine things like, I don't know, the Pepsi wars, people fighting over the last cans of Pepsi, you know, things that are difficult to manufacture on Earth, that we would sometime, you know, suddenly stop taking for granted and think are just precious commodities. That can be a lot of fun in your pot making.
Well, sure. I think part and parcel of this, once you are in space, you are sort of 90% of the way to anywhere that you might want to be, because
Right.
you know, planets have these gravity wells that cost a lot of energy to climb out of. So once you're in space, you can hit the Trojans for asteroid material. You can hit the asteroid belt for, you know, so you should be able to have access to rock and minerals and water. Clearly, there would have to be some kind of infrastructure for getting those materials, you know, transported where they need to go.
Yeah, that sort of brings made me think of something there, Dave. You know, if space is habitable space takes so much resources to make it habitable. I wonder if there would just be a scarcity of just real estate, you know, it's actual space to live in. That would become much more of a problem.
Yeah, I think yes, but something else that we've learned very much about in the last 5 years, I'll say, is how much of it automation can do and how much of it automation can do fairly easily, even though there is oversight. And I think if you're on a space station near the asteroids, it's manned by 3 or 4 people who run the fleet of robots that are doing the actual mining. At least that's my take on it. You know, I mean, NASA very quickly learned, oh yeah, we can do it cheaper with machines. Yes, we can't do it as in person and not as detailed, but we can get better at it. And that's one thing that they did refine.
Yeah, so once you're in space solidly enough, I think the resources are there, and including, as I say, minerals that you can get to and water, probably in frozen form, and it might have to be separated from other things, but I think water and minerals will be things that you can get. Getting them to where they need to go, that's another matter.
It's a different story. Yeah.
You know, bourbon, right? Marty, you mentioned bourbon. Well, if you're on Pluto and you want bourbon, it's got to get there.
Yep. The shipping ain't going to be free like Amazon.
Right.
Listen, I think that you know, giving your lady a rose would become a much more significant gesture. Ours, you know.
Oh yeah. Shipped just fresh this week from Sears, Ceres, the asteroid.
I want to put a little bit of an underline on what Marty just said, because I want to say it was 2004, BosCon in Boston. One of the first panels on a Friday night was about brewing beer in space. And it had a panel of people that were either brewers or people that knew about engineering, and the place became packed. They were not expecting the turnout that they did. And quite quickly, there were 2 different groups of how do you actually separate hops? Do you do it with a slow something centrifugal, or do you have the hops suspended in a porous paddle that turns through the thing? And it turned into 2 camps of people that were adamant about which made-up technology would be the thing that was making beer in space in the future. And I was like, that was brilliant to watch. I want to write a story about, you know, it's Hatfields and the McCoys in space.
The person who can solve that problem is going to make some serious buckets. So I've got some other things. You know, I tend to think that, you know, if you're living in space, it's going to be a lot of steel and rock, right? Steel space stations or hollowed out asteroids, and you might want something to warm that up. So I'm thinking wood would be nice. Now you're not going to ship that from Earth, so pound for pound, your best bet is probably bamboo, right? It makes wood. It's edible. It can be used for clothing. It can be used for all kinds of things. Every part of it's edible. So bamboo may be something that they grow in space or in space stations. And the other one is fish. Pound for pound, you get the best amount of calories versus environment from seafood. So I can imagine this hollowed out asteroids filled with water and spun up to a certain speed full of fish. So yeah, I've got me these, lobster from this particular asteroid or, something like that. But again, it's got to get from there to wherever it needs to go.
I think you're more likely to see a much larger industry when it comes to 3D printed meats and vat-grown meats. The fact that we've seen so much advancement in that in the last couple of years, and if you send out a bunch of robot probes to find the asteroid with the perfect combination of nickel, water, carbon, oxygen, whatever your base compounds are, the 6-7 ingredients that are the most versatile in making the widest variety of meat or foodstuffs to begin with when added with water and specific nutrients, etc. I think that's probably, you might see like the rich guy eating a lobster on Pluto, but more likely they're eating printed food bards that are made in situ in using whatever materials they have there.
Okay. All right. What else is scarce or common in a setting like this?
Well, gravity is common, and it can be utilized. Gravity, as The Expanse showed us, gravity can be weaponized. It can also be used as a leverage and a form as a delivery method for stuff, and that goes back all the way to, that was the whole bit with Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Heinlein, was the whole idea of we can do this solely because Earth is downhill from us. We can, these things can get tossed in that direction and they will go there.
That's true. Moon is a Harsh Mistress depended on the fact that all you needed to do to attack Earth in a war was use a mass driver and shoot rocks at high speed. Yeah.
And a trebuchet would have worked just as well. It probably would have accelerated to close to the same velocities. Given all the footage we saw from Artemis and how much error correction went into, that incoming, flight path, we're going to be there at some point.
And that probably gets to our transport limitations as well. We've already talked at least a little bit about distances to get to these places, but mass drivers are a good way to just send something downrange to get it somewhere. Cheap transport, you just have to have a big net or something to catch it at the other end.
Mm-hmm. And they're practicing. They've already done that. They're going to do more tests with that big upright cyclotron for throwing stuff into low orbit.
Any other transport limitations people can think of?
Well, one thing I learned in economics is that some goods are simply not transportable, or services, of course, are not transportable. So like the example of, you could have a really great deal on haircuts in Montreal, but if you live in Washington, D.C., you just can't capitalize on that good deal. And so I'm thinking about things that might apply here. Maybe you have the absolute best person to configure your whatever, your spaceship, your whatever you need to survive, and they give you the best deals, but they're on a different space station, they're on a different moon, whatever, and you simply can't transport that. I would imagine that problem is just completely doubled, tripled, multiplied by this environment.
And I would add to that for this to work, and for problems like the one that she just addressed to be even attempted to resolve, you would need something, you would need the future equivalent of the modern cargo container. Something that is modular, something that is interchangeable, something that can go from spaceship to space elevator to ground transport to whatever, something that can move the way we move it now from boat to train to truck, the same container containing the same goods.
the futuristic equivalent of one of the shipping containers.
Yeah,
Right.
that's exactly it. I was reading a wonderful story about not the boat that got stuck in the Suez last year or the year before, but one that had an engine problem that's carrying something like 2,000 containers on it. And it was talking about how for each hour that passes, the serial number of each of those containers is updating a database, an automated database somewhere, and each of those containers has an expected arrival time somewhere else, and each of those times are being updated, and it's all being done by machines. And so every minute this passes, this massive spreadsheet is just changing. And that's how our world economy works now, is that we ship it out on a boat and the computers all track it and figure out when it's going to get where and when and on time and all that. So yeah, we
Really
need
important for perishables.
Yeah.
Because so much of the food that we eat now comes from somewhere else on the planet.
Well, one thing about these travel times is it puts us back in, say, when did the Pilgrims come here? 3 months from England to the United States. We've got 3 months to Mars, but we've got 9 years to get to Pluto. So for some of the places in the solar system, they're further away in this scenario than anything we had, back in the 1600s, 1700s.
Yeah, but we're not going to go to Pluto unless Pluto has something that we can't find closer.
Well, sure, there may be scientific outposts, but I don't think it's going to be a space colony.
Right, yeah.
But I think I don't think we're ever going to transport 10 or 12 billion people out of Earth's gravity well to live in space. So I think the biggest resource Earth will have will be people and brain power. Simply the rest of the solar system won't be able to match, not because of unintelligent people, but because for some period of time the rest of the solar system won't have those kinds of numbers. So there could be a whole knowledge economy. We've covered some services. I talked about the loop. I think we've talked about maybe an infrastructure for getting goods sent by a mass driver to various places or transported. What other services do you think might support an economy like this?
I think much the same way that phone technology is partially driven, economically at least, by that weird little underground economy that is salvaging junkyards for parts and materials and rare earths that can't be found at the quantities that are needed. So much of that is delivered into the system sub rosa through non-legit channels. I think we're going to see something like that happen, only involving space junk. When somebody figures out a way to maintain a stable orbit and low Earth orbit and drop a bunch of big sticky tethers down 7 or 8 kilometers to the edge of the atmosphere and just collect all those screws and all that stuff that's winging around up there and pull it back up, not only providing a service, but also saying, hey, I have a hold full of salvage now, and it contains materials you guys haven't had access to in several decades because you ran out of them. I think that's going to be sort of the edge case type of thing. David Brin's Existence, the book Existence, the whole open is about the people that are basically the salvagers of space detritus.
Interesting. All right, Marty, anything?
Well, when I think of services that would be necessary throughout the solar system, I think of like medical services. You're not going to have a heart specialist on a faraway colony or space station or something. So I imagine that there will be methods created for doing medicine via Zoom or whatever the iteration of it is in the future.
Well, I could see a doctor directing, via that mechanism, some sort of AI robot, you know, giving the strategy and letting the robot, you know, auto doc carry it out or something like that. That would seem to be futuristic technology, but you know, we're in the future. Shay?
Yeah, I guess one thing that comes to mind, other than I was also thinking medical, is repair services. And I know this just by taking a bloody motorized wheelchair, to one state to the other. If it breaks down, it's like World War III or not, or it's the apocalypse. It's a better way to say it. I'm stuck there, because it's such a specialized piece of machinery. So I don't know, unless we have a way to generalize our machinery, or to have very universally applicable technology that we could enlist and employ a lot of repairmen. It would be hard to get specific repairmen for specific technologies that people rely upon with the transportation issues. So that's the only thing that comes to mind. Yeah, one thing I was tossing around thinking, just applying it to this model, if legal services would be a challenge. But I suppose, a lot of the sci-fi I've read, it seems like that's the one thing that seems to be pretty airtight, is like a legal code in the solar system that is pretty rigidly enforced. So I don't know, maybe that's just fiction. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, and actually, I think the legal system would be a little bit hard to enforce across these types of distances.
Okay.
We only had 3 months between us and England, and we got pretty pissed off when they tried to tax us in the ways that we didn't want to be taxed.
Yeah.
And that was just 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
3 months of travel, maybe less if you knew what you were doing and had good winds. So when you start having things that are like 9 years away, 4 years away.
But the other thing, Shay, that I think about when you talk about that is that how much I'm seeing in the advances that we're seeing right now in things like modular robotics and what they call soft robots, the things that are designed to crawl through pipes and things like that. And they are building these robots that can affix themselves to each other in different configurations, and through machine learning can actually say, oh, here is a problem that we now have to solve, or this is a thing we have to enclose, or a thing we have to elevate, etc. And yes, we're in the very beginning of the second generation of that now, but I think the end game for that type of technology would be something that is fairly modular, that is customized for whatever kind of gravity environment that one's dealing with. And this could be anything from not just a wheelchair or robotic legs. This could be a heart pump. This could be insulin monitoring. If you've got enough software and if you've got enough stuff that does the job good enough to get it done, I think between miniaturization and modularization, I think a lot of the issues, the specific issues that can be a big deal to us, that there will be off-the-shelf solutions, that if you bring enough of this type of module or this type of thing, you can actually achieve a lot of what you're doing. And the last 5% of it would be something that is specialized for whatever the need is that needs to be addressed.
Of course, that assumes that you have the equipment, the money and wherewithal to have the good equipment with all the backups and the nice repair bots and stuff. But then you get to the fringes where life is much harder and you're using 70-year-old equipment and stuff, and your ship breaks down. I could see stories right there.
Oh yeah, there's been stories.
We'll come rescue you, but it's going to cost you 50% of your ship. We'll be your partners now.
Yeah, what was the Alistair Reynolds trilogy about the two sisters that own the ship? I can't think of it right now. Revenger was one of them. Yeah, all that had to deal with how services interact with goods, not simply an exchange of one for the other, but also having the key rule in that particular solar system is if you're going to do this, you need to have skin in the game. And that's kind of having skin in the game with yourself and your own property and the things that you manage, and even your digital footprint, having that as almost the gold standard that the economy works on is a big part of that book, a big part of those books.
So how do you think government will play into the economics of the future?
Not very much if Elon has anything to say about it.
One can only hope.
But I think you're going to see a lot more things like that. I think the first stages of any expansion like this is going to be a need it needs fulfilling. Now, fortunately, we have found other helium sources on Earth, but that's only because we made a intensive search for them. So things like MRI machines and stuff like that are going to be a thing for the foreseeable future, and the need for getting extraterrestrial helium as a major part of the economy is at least pushed back a little bit for now. But if somebody finds that the ice on Enceladus is has enough mineral and saline built into it that it's actually blocking anything in the water from radiation, oh, suddenly we've got ice that can block very intense gas giant radiation. That's going to be a thing. That ice is going to go, someone's going to go chop that ice up and turn it into everything. You know, it's like, okay, if we have this as our shielding, we can go anywhere now. So I think it's going to be a bit of opportunistic spurts when it comes to, okay, there's a thing over here, we need to go get it because we have a definite use for it, so it's worth us putting the investment in to go and get it. And if we can get a lot of it and throw it back at Earth, you know, we've just done something that we've just made a part of the economy that didn't exist a little while ago, and now we can work with it.
All right, I'll forward Marty's question on to Shay. How does this impact government?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can see a lot of decentralization. I mean, again, I mean, sci-fi makes it seem, I feel like there's probably a very big chasm between sci-fi and reality when it comes to government, because I've seen a lot of examples in sci-fi where there's, you know, the one central ruler, the emperor, the whatever. But I don't see that being realistic. I see this being decentralized, as much hands-off regulations as possible, so that corporations can bear the burden of most of the expenses, and can, you know, operate as they need to actually make some kind of profit in such challenging economic conditions with everything we were talking about, with scarcity, with transportation issues and all that. So yeah, it would have to be super hands-off from the government, I think, for anything to be feasible.
I would agree when it comes to the actual operations that are out in the farther parts. I think when you're dealing with much more inner system, I really liked the way, and really the way they did it on The Expanse, which kind of
Me too. I love that.
yeah, the fact that yes, the old governments of Earth and then later on Mars are still trying to control everything because they are the ones that are supplying everything that makes it go, but it's the belters and the miners who are the ones that are actually providing a lot of the raw materials. And there is very little governance out there, and as a result, but because the governance is so still strong on Earth, they feel they don't have a voice. So I think, yes, bureaucracy gets ratcheted up, but I also think a lot of bureaucracy can also be automated as well when you're dealing with data sets of this size, and when you're dealing with materials of this quantity. I mean, let's face facts. You're taking the GDP of the Earth and all the materials that are produced, harvested, grown, mined, etc., and you're looking at the potential of expanding that times 100, just given the size of the number of asteroids and the size of the gas giants that can be mined, etc. You're literally talking about upping a GDP 100 times, provided you're willing to sink the cash into it first.
And, you know, to be honest with you, I think that the answer to that question would also depend on the condition Earth at the time. Is Earth really suffering? Is Earth at a point of no return with its own, climate, resources, population? And if it's really at a suffering point, then I could see more government involvement so that there's equitable distribution of that energy and that resource to help people at home. If things are stable relatively, or maybe like kind of around where we are now, where it's not so great, but it's not like a crisis point, then I think you'd see, less government involvement. But I think it would really depend on the conditions of back at home.
All right, and Marty, government, you get to answer your own question.
Yeah, I think that government's going to be the first vanguard into space, and because they're going to be out there planting those flags, everybody's going to, want their own base, and that's, stuff will grow up around that. And so I think that government will try to, govern more than would be useful, because they're not the experts in the challenges that are going to come. It's going to be weird. It is going to be totally weird.
But you were talking about planting flags and all. I think that a little nationalism could be healthy for developing some of these advanced, systems in space. We certainly have great cooperation right now across nations, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing as far as International Space Station and all that jazz.
Toss Russia and China in your direction and say, "Oh yeah, cooperation."
Well, yeah, that too. But I think another 1960s JFK era push with American idealism and American.
But
yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
You bring up something very good here, because that's what happened in the 60s with the space program is a very good example of something that happens a lot. Same thing happened with ocean going in Europe, which led to colonization. Governments are very good at leading the way in spending a lot of money for what's effectively a very expensive proof of concept. Okay, and once that hurdle is done, everybody else jumps on it. Elon wouldn't have done jack without NASA for the last 50 years, just because of the fact that they sank all their capital into proving that this stuff was good by getting the best minds together and showing that it was good. And the same thing happened with shipping and compasses and longitude and all that stuff. All of that stuff was first launched by government agencies because they knew we got to get to that other country because we got to access their goods, or we have to subjugate their people, or whatever. And then, Dutch East India doesn't have its own fleet until, several other nations have fleets going around. And now they say, there's effective ways and economical ways of doing this that make it feasible. And then boom, suddenly they become the biggest company in the world for hundreds of years. But yeah, if
difference with the solar system, though, when you talked about colonization and trade on our planet, they were bringing back things that they would be able to sell and make high profits locally. What are they going to be able to harvest out in the universe, out in the solar system, that we don't have, and that we're going to, get spices from Mars that we can't get here?
I don't necessarily know about that, but a lot of manufacturing would probably be better off in space. A lot of steel, rather than digging up mountains and mining to get the raw ingredients for steel. Get it from an asteroid, create some really big steel bars and drop them through the atmosphere and say, here's your iron bar, go pick it up and do what you want with it.
Or there's also been some blueprints of completely covering the sun in satellites, completely harvesting the energy of the sun. So that would definitely answer your question.
And the one other thing, we keep bringing up asteroids here, and we have to remember something, that we need a lot more data on this, because we have had 2 recent missions that have made impacts with asteroids, and in neither case was the asteroid a big solid piece of rock. They were both just aggregations of smaller rocks held together by mutual gravity. And especially the DART mission, the fact that they saw the entirety of the mass wobble as its bloom went up. So I think the first thing we need to know is at what point is an asteroid a solid piece of rock, like a piece of debris from another body or something like that. Because if not, I think most of the rocks that are sitting in the asteroid belt are probably going to be just big aggregations of pebbles that never achieved the mutual gravity to have the heat to fuse them together. And if so, one of our favorite images in science fiction book covers of the hollowed out asteroid is probably going to be a lot rarer than we think.
But we'll be able to send out automated fleets of little drones to investigate all these asteroids.
Oh yeah.
And,
we can
find what might be useful.
We're not so much mining them as basically shoveling them into a bin. You know, it's getting them all into a big Ziploc bag and tossing that back at Earth.
Yeah, but I do want to address the government.
In space to build more infrastructure in space. I think that there's plenty of steel on Earth right now. And if you're going to have a gold rush into outer space and stabilize the population on Earth, or even if the population begins to go down for various reasons, you know, you got enough resources here that they wouldn't need more. At least the expensive stuff that they have to bring back from outer space.
Well, I think, you know, let's say 300 years from now, I think they may need to do a little bit of terraforming to make Earth a bit more livable. So, you know, you may not want to be having those mines or those coal plants and stuff on Earth. You may want to have, you know, energy from, you know, manufacturing in space and start doing some of the re-terraforming stuff on Earth. Who knows? Plus, you know, if the population is, you know, 12 billion people, I mean, that's a lot of people to support. But I wanted to talk about some of the government issues as well, because I'm kind of with the Expanse that I think government's going to try to keep as much control as they can for as long as they can. But I feel like, just as with Britain and the US, I feel like it's a losing battle, because ultimately the solar system is the frontier, which we haven't had in a long time.
Yeah.
And with the frontier, you know, if you really look at the boundaries of the solar system, it stretches all the way out to the Oort cloud, which is, you know, beyond Pluto, and that stretches out almost halfway to Alpha Centauri. So if you got those fringe groups that want to get away from that government in the solar system, and they have enough money and gear to go make their space station or a hollowed out asteroid or whatever, I could see some very decentralized societies and maybe some very experimental societies. You know, for instance, like real democracies where every vote is actually counted and there's no electoral process or anything. Everybody votes and it's tabulated electronically, and, you know, et cetera, pure democracy, or lots of other experiments.
Mike Resnick did a series of stories that were put together in a book called Kiranyaga, which was about a group of Kakiri natives from Africa who were living on a space habitat. And the premise of the book came from an idea for an anthology where it was different groups, different isolated ethnic groups are approached by this agency and said, we're going to send you to a habitat. It's yours. We can make the environment anything you want, and it's your utopia. And you can live exactly the way you want there. And he wanted the editor wanted a series of stories to show how if you were handed your setting like that, things would still go horribly wrong. As they explore with the Mormons in The Expanse.
I recall he won a couple of Hugos for those stories.
He did. It's a very good series. It's a very good series. But it was supposed to have been, he wrote the first one as his submission to this anthology, which was going to be about these utopias and showing how the concept itself can be flawed depending on the dynamics at play.
All right. Well, I'm going to go on to another slide for a second.
Okay.
Something we haven't talked about. Space tourism. This is base jumping on Miranda, which is a scene from Wonders, a 2011 little short film narrated by Carl Sagan. Miranda is the moon of Uranus. So space tourism, is that a thing? Is that economically viable?
It sure would. Rich people would, would be doing it because they can.
I mean, in British society, rich people would tour the continent, tour Europe. Could you tour the solar system? I don't know.
Yeah, but the people that did that in Europe were the people that made all their money exploiting all the other regions that they were touring. And I think what's going to happen here is the people that end up making the most money from all of these solar system endeavors we've been talking about are the ones that are going to go say, I'm going to go, hang glide off of Olympus Mons now, just to show that it's doable, or something along those lines. I think the first time any of these is done is going to be the equivalent of Jeff Bezos, or Richard Branson or Elon Musk doing one of their stunts that they have done recently. And I think once they show that it's done, then yes, people will line up and go, yes, I will give you money if you take me to the edge of space for 90 seconds. And
what about the distances? If you want to get to the moon of Neptune, wow, that's some time. That's like 8 years to get there.
Well, it's gonna depend on how motivated they are and what support infrastructure is around there. Are there habitats in orbit around Miranda all reason because we're mining something nearby? Right. Or there's trailing asteroids in the Lagrange point or whatever. Do we have do we have a presence out there? I mean, nobody would have climbed Everest if there wasn't something easily exploitable all around the base of Everest, and there was people, and that's kind of why people looked up at it. And it's not because it's there; it's because it's there in close proximity to this other thing I need to keep an eye on because I have a financial stake in it now.
Right. Shay, space tourism. What do you think?
Well, first I want to respond to the topic of Mount Everest. I mean, would that also apply to, there's not much in Antarctica, but still there's a pretty hefty tourist and, in a couple of decades ago, centuries ago, exploration drives to explore the South Pole. So I'm not sure that there has to be an exploitative factor to have curiosity.
But those first trips to Antarctica were all sponsored by governments at first, and there was a lot of national rivalry that was going on.
Yeah. I think I'm more in line with that argument than the argument that there is factors to exploit in that geographic location.
But that comes later. That's what I'm talking about. That comes later. That comes after all that government stuff has already shown that it's doable. The reason
I will point out that there is a tourism there is tourism for Antarctica.
Yes, totally. I want to go.
It took over 100 years.
Tourism for the International Space Station.
Yeah, but
the tourism for Antarctica. I have a coworker that I worked with at my last company. She and her friend, they ran a marathon on Antarctica.
Yeah.
With the
there are so many boats that are leaving both South America and South Africa that go in and around. There is so much ship traffic down there now.
I love that. Yeah.
She's got pictures of herself running with seals and penguins and stuff in the background. So
anyway, I just want to make that comment before I talked about what I think of space tourism. Number one, I think that we're already seeing it. We already said this. I think space tourism is the very first thing that we're going to see as far as economies in space. I think we oftentimes think of tourism and, vacationing, travel as a luxury. It is, but in this situation, it's not something that comes after needs are met. It's something that's coming first. And I think that's very interesting. The second thing I want to bring up was in response to, I think it was you, Dave, or when you guys mentioned something about, taking 8 years to get somewhere, or the amount of time it would take. The only thing I have to say about that is we're going to see a very interesting population of people willing to do that. Very, you know, I mean, I don't mean to be judgmental, but it's going to be a population of people who don't have many family connections, you know, don't have responsibilities. Maybe you're kind of at the end of their rope, end of their luck. Maybe even suicidal people, you know, that say, I'm done, but hey, may as well do this. Nothing else to lose. We need to keep an eye on, you know, the mental health aspect of traveling that far. And if that's even, is that even responsible of us to, you know, maybe speaking of exploit, you know, maybe it would be kind of exploitative of people who are really kind of down on their luck, end of their rope, ready to kick the bucket.
Well, there can also be a status thing. For instance, there's people who go, I've climbed the 10 highest mountains on the world.
Yeah,
Or,
but no billionaire who wants status is going to sacrifice 16 years of using their money on Earth to sit in a spaceship traveling to whatever.
I think some people will do it for that status. Or for instance, you know that base jumping, base is actually an acronym, right?
Oh, really?
Base stands for the 4 different things that you could jump off of. Building, antenna, which is usually some kind of like, you know, antenna tower, span, a bridge, and earth, like jumping off a cliff. So there's about 2,000 people who have been certified as having done all 4, right? And they have rules for like, it has to be at least X number of meters, et cetera, in order to count. So it's a thing to actually be certified as a base jumper. And then they have another certification for people who have done it at night. So I could see, here's the 10 most extreme things to do in the solar system, and somebody needs to spend, you know, 16 years doing it. That there might be some people that would do it just for some sort of status symbol. Because even if you're out at Pluto, you could be still on the internet, whatever the equivalent is in the future. Anyway, it's something to think about. So are we positive about the idea that space tourism is going to exist at least at the scale I'm talking about on this slide here?
I think it's probably an inevitable after effect, but I think a lot of things have to get done first. You need to have enough of a presence, and like I mentioned, support infrastructure. A lot of that has to be in place before you see people doing this.
I mean, there's some stories there. There's got to be.
Oh, yeah, there have been. There's been tons of them. The 70s was full of that weird little consensus future that the Rand Corporation said we were all going to be living in the year 2020, where we're, you know, regularly flying ships to Mars for research purposes. They treated Mars like it was Antarctica back in the 70s. They figured that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be going there regularly, seeing what's going on, and then seeing what we can do with it.
All right, I'm head for the next slide. Jupiter, as seen by the Juno space probe. Atmospheric mining for things like you know, hydrogen for ion thrusters, deuterium, otherwise known as hydrogen-2 for fusion, or helium-3 also for fusion, maybe for futuristic rocket drives, available from all of your various gas giants, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. So the idea behind atmospheric mining is you either have a ship that dips down into the atmosphere and scoops up materials, or you have some kind of aerostat, you know, a balloon type collector that collects whatever you're looking for, and then one way or another ships it into orbit, and from there you ship it around the solar system. In other words, the inner sphere might have the power and the people, but the outer fringes of the solar system might actually have the fuel in the amounts and with the accessibility that the rest of the solar system will need. What kind of impact does that have on our economy?
I think, first of all, when it comes to gases, I think you're going to see them gathered as a as either a side effect or a main effect of breaking down asteroids before we ever start looking at the gas giants. And secondly, when it comes to that, a lot of science fiction in the past has always treated gas giants as, oh, you know, Arthur C. Clarke did this famously. It's like, oh, look, we have a gas giant. We have tons of free fuel. Well, no, because whoever's actually going and getting it and then bringing it back is the one who owns that fuel. So it's not free, and it's going to depend on how it's done.
Well, I'm not assuming it's free. I'm assuming whoever's getting it is going to charge some money for it.
Oh yeah,
it will be expensive, and it probably won't have very many humans involved. It'll be clearly automated.
Yeah, in that regard, I agree. If you could build a fairly inexpensive system of some kind of a, like you mentioned, the aerostat, or some kind of a space elevator, space straw, so to say, that reaches down deep enough into a gas giant, pumps up the contents, goes through some kind of processing where it's frozen, encapsulated in something else, and then put through a spinny thing and yeeted towards the Earth at high velocity. If you could do that in a relatively inexpensive way and then replicate it over and over again, yeah, you could have a ton of stuff heading inward.
All right, Shay, thoughts?
My thoughts are, did Jeff just say a space straw?
Yeah. It's basically what it would be. It goes down into the atmosphere, it starts pulling stuff up. You have some kind of a pump at the top that pulls it up, exposes it to space, freezes it, and sends it to Earth.
Sort of like a space elevator, but it doesn't go all the way down to the
Yeah,
surface.
because it's a gas giant.
Or, you know, that's how, you know, fuel stations function in the future. They don't send it to Earth. They use it to fuel up, you know, mass drives.
I mean, the only other comment I would add is I know from experience, like my grandma in the last last year of her life was on oxygen, and it was like one of those little portable ones that you could take around and go to grocery shopping, whatever she wanted to do. But you don't realize how much oxygen a person actually goes through in one of those tanks. Like, you know, a tiny little tank only lasted her, you know, this big. It only lasted her like, you know, 3 hours maximum, and it would have to be like replaced or refilled. And so I think that it's the idea of storing this stuff, you know, storing oxygen is also something that would be super prohibitive. Just there'd have to be a much more efficient way of having a technology to actively create it in one canister rather than having to continuously replace it.
But to the oxygen tank as we know it now is the end result of a bunch of technological advancements that ran head on to a lot of medical regulation. There are other ways to deliver oxygen, and there are other systems for producing oxygen at scale. And depending on if you're in a habitat or if you're in a ship by yourself or whatever, there are ways to scale that up and down. I mean, they've been doing all that testing with plant matter and fungal matter up on the ISS to see literally how much O2 you can generate on a cubic foot, meter, inch, whatever basis, and they're looking to see if this is something that's scalable. How do you optimize it? What nutrients do you use to optimize it? How much sunk cost goes into that? Because yeah, there's a lot of interest in can we deliver oxygen in an efficient way, and what do we need to bring with us in order to do it?
I think that's also the gold standard there. If wherever you are, if you're not self-sufficient for things like food, air, and water, then you're a station with outside supply,
Right.
not a colony.
Right, and I think what we're seeing now with 3D printing and metamaterials and the fact that materials sciences is such a major thing right now, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody was able to develop some kind of a polymer that wouldn't be eternal, but would have some way of when it was struck by sunlight or when it was exposed to something, it could give off a steady supply of O2 for a prolonged period of time. And if it could work in a system where part of it could exist in vacuum and part of it could exist in a habitat or a ship or whatever, it's the kind of thing that could be done. I think there are ways around that that are being explored right now. If you read like phys.org or any of the material sciences websites, they have tons, and every day somebody's figured out a new way to make something, and it's like, it's stunning that they're doing it with such simplified ways of doing it. So,
and as far as mining, you know, again, I think it's just a matter of how the conditions are on Earth, because humans, I think anyway, are notoriously bad at thinking far ahead. In the sense that, you know, if we are still having success with fossil fuels, and we still have, you know, to us anyway, a sustainable resource for those fuels, I don't see corporations and nations with their economies investing in mining these different types of fuels, or doing that instead of creating them on Earth, just because of the cost of that and the extent of it. So I really think some of these
fuels that I've mentioned, they're a little bit rare on Earth, and you'd have to go through an awful lot of seawater to get to them. They're much less rare on the gas giants.
But some, I think in general in this whole conversation, some of these economies that we're envisioning will just simply not arise unless we need to turn to them, unless the alternatives domestically suddenly are eliminated. And that could very well be the case, but I'm just saying, I don't think that some of these economies will live in harmony with current economies. It would have to replace them.
Well, sure. We're talking about a solar system that's fairly well populated. There's a pretty good amount of futuristic development that has to be done. Oops, I think we lost Jeff.
He's just running off to, I don't know, call up Elon, tell him what we're talking about, tell him to tune in.
All right. Well, I'm going to go to the next slide, and I believe this is the last slide. Belters. I love belters. I love the grizzled, hardworking miners of the asteroid belt. Economically viable or not?
I think it's going to be more robots than actual people.
That's fair.
I don't think that you're going to get, like your image showed, guys in spacesuits out there with jackhammers. That's not going to be the thing. Have laser drilling guys.
Yeah, I want to believe in that because it's cool, but I just don't think it's going to happen.
No, that's not going to happen. You are going to have advanced robotics actually wandering through, detecting first and then harvesting second.
Yeah, so even the miners of the expanse, I don't think we're going to have that. Yeah. Wish it weren't so, but
yeah, but in the books, they're actually much more they're managing the technology than doing the mining. It's not like the movie Outland where they're putting on suits and going down in and jackhammering into the crust of an asteroid.
Well, they were on the moon of Jupiter, actually.
Yeah, but they're.
I did like that movie anyway.
Yeah,
even if it's not too plausible.
Yeah, it's going to be much more. And I think the other thing is, the one thing that we're sort of leaving out of this equation is that the fact that our economy right now, with all of its globalization and with all of its physical capabilities, is pretty much managed by data, and 99% of that data is being analyzed on its own. Banks and banks of automated servers that are doing this. And I think if you want to build something like this up to scale, especially when you're dealing with light speed limitations at that thing, I think we're going to see something akin to a lot of this data analysis and data management and data movement and machine learning and whatever comes after machine learning effectively being crowdsourced. I think part of how you're going to be able to monetize stuff is that if I've got a habitat or a spaceship or whatever, and I've got X amount of computing power, and if I say I'm going to hand off 3% of my computing power to whatever data is being analyzed at this nearby thing here, sort of the way we did with SETI at home back in the 90s, I think that's going to be an economic factor, because you're not going to be able to haul up these big giant blocks of servers, regardless of what Moore's law says. You're not going to be able to build server farms in orbit around Jupiter, nor would you have the need to if you could actually crowdsource this stuff to nearby other processing that's happening around you.
All right, so I think we've killed the belters. And we've covered quite a bit about our futuristic economy in the solar system. Does anybody have any final thoughts about our economy? Marty?
I think it's going to be very heavily dependent on population. If the population keeps ascending in the way that it is, that people are just going to simply want elbow room. And that will be a driving factor for expansion out into the solar system. I think it's going to be more important than we realize at all.
All right, Jeff?
I think there was a book that came out in 2019 by William Davies. It came out from MIT Press. It was called Economic Science Fictions. And it talked about not just scientific advances, but it talked about economic advances that it would bring. And there are a number of short stories, but there's also essays by a number of different people. And I read this book last year, and I found it really, really fascinating. It covers the spectrum of economic realities and economic theories and economic models. And there was some interesting stuff. I would like to have seen a few of the other things done, but I think aside from new ways of gaining materials, and as I think we've seen with not just the Bitcoin disaster, but the fact that what's not being addressed is that things like blockchains are being used quite successfully in a lot of other things right now, that are not crashing and burning the way that a lot of cryptocurrency has. And I think that's something new that really didn't exist. It was a theory in the 90s, I think, and the fact that it can be done now. And I think as automation increases, and I think as economic complexity increases, I think we're going to see more and more of that, not just the technology of expansion into the solar system advancing, but the technology for actually keeping track of how we monetize things and apply value to them as well.
Okay. And Shay?
Yeah, I think this was a really interesting discussion. I think for the sake of this topic, but also for the sake of our audience out there who's looking to apply this topic to their writing, into their road building, we haven't really talked much about how to actually take this information or these thoughts and create a good story out of it or good characters out of it. And so I guess my final comment would be like, take these ideas, but also classic economic theories and models like comparative advantage, absolute advantage, tax, transportation costs, a bunch of stuff that we were talking about, and apply it to the question, how would this be affected by this? How would us going into space, doing and endeavoring into this field affect this model? Would it change? Would it hold? And how would that play out? You could have some very interesting characters, like what would an economist, maybe your character could be an economist, trying to convince the nations, or whatever, the military commanders, if it's military sci-fi. There's all sorts of things that you can do, but don't just take this as an interesting conversation. Take this as inspiration to apply it to your book, your world building, and ask some pretty compelling questions to spin an interesting plot for your audience. I think there's a lot here for us to work off of, for everyone to work off of.
And also, my closing thought will be, I'll basically second that. What I look for in a setting is the opportunity for conflict with people who want different things. And here we have the inner sphere probably wants certain things. The government wants control. The big corporations want to make money. Splinter groups want to spread out and get away from government tyranny. People living in the outer fringes want to be independent. New developments, new ways to have friction, new technologies. I think that's ripe for all kinds of stories. And I think you can do stories without being, without slavishly copying The Expanse or anything like that.
Right. David, that's one of the key key, we call it statements or like pinnacles of economics applies to what you just said. And that's that there is an infinite number of wants for a finite number of resources and abilities to fulfill those wants. And so I think what you just said is perfectly applicable to that statement.
Yeah, there was a series, it was a 2-book series by Tony Daniels. The first book was called Metaplanetary, and it had to do with different economic interests in inner and outer solar system just because of the realities of living there and their technological levels and the fact that not every single part of culture was compatible with every other part of culture. And I think you're looking at things like that happening as well. You're looking at not just disparities in lifestyle, but also in modes of existence and how one would actually live their life. And I'm also reminded of the old joke about the guy that, you know, for his birthday, he gives himself a trip to the lunar base, and he lands on the lunar base and he walks around and he goes, oh, there's a bar. And he walks in and he orders a Budweiser, and the guy says, that'll be $400. And he goes, $400? And the bartender says, you're paying for the atmosphere. Yeah.
Oh, man. And on that note,
Final word. Hey, Jeff, thanks again for stopping in.
Not a problem.
Great to have
Thanks
you.
for having me.
It was a lot of fun.
It was.
Both of our watchers are really going to enjoy this episode.
Hi, Mom.
We'll see you all next week. Thanks.